You know, I used to think Jessica was the perfect partner. Smart, driven, funny, one of those people who could light up a room just by walking in. When she got promoted to a senior position at her company, I was thrilled for her. It was a big deal. She worked her ass off for it. And even though it meant more late nights and business trips, I told her I'd support her every step of the way. What kind of husband wouldn't? It all started a couple of weeks ago, during one of those trips. Jessica had flown out to Seattle for a big client pitch, and I was holding down the fort at home. Typical routine, right? But that's when it happened. The little crack in the perfect life I thought we had. She left her work laptop at home by mistake. Said she'd use her phone for everything she needed while she was away. I wouldn't have even touched the thing if she hadn't called me. Frantic, saying she needed a document emailed ASAP for the pitch. Being the helpful husband I always was, I grabbed the laptop, booted it up, and bam, there it was. A chat window popped up right in the middle of the screen. Last night was amazing. Can't wait for the next trip. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. I just stared at it, frozen, reading those words over and over again. My first instinct was denial. Maybe it was some work-related thing, an inside joke I didn't understand. But then my brain, that stupidly loyal part of me, reminded me of something. There's no way that could be a professional message. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the damn laptop. I took a deep breath, or tried to anyway. My chest felt like it was in a vice. I clicked on the chat window, my heart pounding louder with every second. The messages were right there, all laid out in front of me. Flirty, suggestive, and then downright explicit, and the name attached to it. Her boss. It felt like my entire world collapsed in that moment. Here I was, thinking I was married to this incredible, ambitious woman, and meanwhile, she was sneaking around with her boss behind my back. And it wasn't just a fling either. This had been going on for months. Business trips, late-night meetings. Those weren't just excuses. They were opportunities. I didn't cry. Not then, at least. The tears came later. Instead, I sat there, staring at the screen, reading and rereading every filthy, intimate thing they said to each other. The worst part, there was a moment where I wondered if this was my fault. Had I missed the signs? Had I let our marriage drift into autopilot while she found something or someone more exciting? But no, screw that. This wasn't on me. This was her betrayal. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I didn't do anything except sit there, replaying every moment of our life together in my head, searching for clues I'd overlooked. Little things that suddenly took on new meaning. The way she smiled at her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. The business trips that seemed a little too frequent. The worst part was realizing how easily she'd lied to me, and I never suspected a thing. After that sleepless night, I knew I couldn't let it go. I mean, how could I? Pretend everything was fine while she was out there playing house with her boss? No! I needed proof. Cold, hard evidence, not just for me, but for whatever came next. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I hired a private investigator. It felt surreal, sitting there in the PI's cramped office, explaining the situation to a complete stranger. The guy didn't flinch, though. This was just another Tuesday for him. He asked all the right questions, names, dates, places she'd been. I gave him everything I had, which wasn't much, just a gut feeling and that damning chat message. He promised to keep it discreet, and I went home feeling like a mix of a detective and a failure. But it was out of my hands now. A few days later, Jessica came home from her trip, acting like nothing had changed. I couldn't look her in the eye. Every time she smiled at me, it felt like a dagger twisting in my chest. And the worst part, she seemed so normal. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about my week, even brought me one of those stupid souvenirs she always grabbed at airports. Like I was just supposed to play along. I was dying inside. Every word out of her mouth felt like a lie, but I held it together. I had to. The PI needed time to do his thing, and I needed a game plan. And then the bombshell hit. Jessica came home early one afternoon, her face pale and eyes red. She looked like she'd been crying. My first thought was that the jig was up, that she knew I'd hired someone, and this was her way of getting ahead of the fallout. But no, she said we needed to talk. I sat down, bracing myself for whatever bullshit excuse she was about to spin. But her story took a turn I wasn't expecting. She said her boss, yes, the same guy she was screwing, had been pressuring her into the relationship, that he'd been using his position to manipulate her, threatening her job if she didn't go along with it. I didn't know what to think. Part of me wanted to believe her. It's easier to see your partner as a victim than as a monster, right? But another part of me was screaming that this was just another layer of her lies. She swore she never wanted it, that she felt trapped, but she couldn't deny the messages I'd seen. Those weren't the words of someone being coerced. Those were the words of someone enjoying themselves. She begged me to believe her, tears streaming down her face. "Scott, I didn't know what to do," she sobbed. I felt like I had no choice. I didn't say a word, just sat there, staring at her, trying to make sense of it all. Was she really the victim here? Or was this just damage control because she knew I was getting close to the truth? I told her I needed time to think, and she nodded, looking relieved. Relieved, like she thought I'd just take her at her word and we could move on. But that night, when she went to bed, I stayed up. I opened her laptop again, combing through every inch of it. And that's when I found something that made my blood run cold. She wasn't just a pawn in her boss's game. No, Jessica was playing her own game. I found emails carefully worded, but clear as day, that hinted at blackmail. She wasn't being forced into anything. She was using their affair to her advantage, leveraging it for promotions, raises, perks. I sat there staring at the screen, my hands trembling. This wasn't just infidelity. This was a whole new level of deceit. What the hell was I supposed to do with this? The next morning, I couldn't even look at her. I felt like I was living with a stranger, a dangerous one at that. I mean, blackmail, promotions. She wasn't just cheating on me. She was playing some corporate Game of Thrones, and I was the idiot sitting on the sidelines, thinking we had a happy marriage. The private investigator called me that afternoon. He'd been busy, and, as it turns out, Jessica and her boss weren't exactly careful. Photos, timestamps, the whole deal. The guy was married too, with kids. That twisted the knife even more. It wasn't just me she was wrecking. It was his family too. But then the PI dropped another bomb. He'd overheard something in one of their meetings, something that made my stomach churn. Jessica's boss knew about the blackmail. He wasn't just sitting there, taking it. He was planning to turn the tables on her. Apparently, he'd been gathering his own dirt messages, photos, even financial transactions. Jessica's little game wasn't as airtight as she thought. He was threatening to expose her, not just to their company, but to me, her husband. I guess he didn't know I was already way ahead of him on that front. I hung up, my head spinning. This wasn't just a domestic issue anymore. This was a full-blown disaster waiting to blow up in our faces. If her boss made good on his threats, we'd both go down her career, my reputation, everything. And I hadn't even done anything wrong. That night, Jessica must have sensed my mood because she kept her distance. I couldn't bring myself to confront her. Not yet. I needed more time to think, to figure out how to handle this mess without dragging myself down with her. But the clock was ticking. Over the next few days, I watched her more closely. Every text she sent, every call she made, I found myself analyzing it, trying to decode her true intentions. Was she scared? Ashamed? Or was she still plotting, still trying to stay one step ahead? One night, after she'd gone to bed, I decided to check her phone. She usually kept it locked, but I'd seen her passcode before, one of those stupid things you don't think about until you need it. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it. What I found, it was worse than I'd expected. She wasn't trying to back out of the situation. No, Jessica was doubling down. There were texts to her boss, full of veiled threats and promises. She wasn't the victim here, she was the aggressor, and she wasn't going down without a fight. The worst part, she'd mentioned me, not by name, but in a way that made it clear she'd use our marriage as a shield if things got ugly. He'd never believe you over me, she'd written. Not after everything I've told him about you. It was like a slap in the face. She wasn't just destroying my trust, she was preparing to weaponize it. At that moment, I knew there was no fixing this. Not with her, not with her boss, not with anything. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a war, and I was caught in the crossfire. I closed the phone, put it back where I found it, and sat in the dark, trying to figure out my next move. Because one thing was clear, I couldn't keep living like this. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see those texts, hear Jessica's words echoing in my head. He'd never believe you over me. It wasn't just betrayal, it was arrogance. She thought she had me wrapped around her finger, that no matter what she did, I'd be too blinded by love or stupidity to see the truth. I woke up with one goal. I needed to take control. No more sitting around waiting for the next shoe to drop. If Jessica thought she could manipulate me into being her unwitting pawn in this mess, she had another thing coming. First, I called the private investigator again. I needed to know just how bad things could get if this all came out. He told me straight. If her boss went public with their affair and the blackmail, Jessica's career would be over, and I'd be dragged through the mud as collateral damage. Lawsuits, scandal, maybe even criminal charges. It wasn't just her life she'd burned to the ground, it was ours. But then the PI said something that stopped me cold. You know, Scott, you've got leverage here too. You've got the proof. You just have to decide how far you're willing to go. That hit me like a ton of bricks. I hated the idea of stooping to their level, of playing these sick little games. But what choice did I have? If Jessica and her boss were going to tear each other apart, I needed to make sure I wasn't caught in the fallout. So I made a plan. A messy, desperate plan, but a plan nonetheless. That evening, I told Jessica we needed to talk. I'd been avoiding her for days, so she looked surprised but relieved. I was hoping we could sit down, she said, her voice soft, like she hadn't just spent the last few months ruining our lives. I want to make things right. I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral. I think that's a good idea. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd planned vacations, birthdays, anniversaries. It felt wrong, but I pushed through. I need to know everything, I said. No more lies. She hesitated, and for a moment, I thought maybe she'd come clean. But then her face hardened. I already told you. He forced me into it. I didn't have a choice. There it was. The same story. The same bullshit. I'd hoped, somewhere deep down, that she might still have some shred of honesty left in her. But no, she was doubling down. So I did the same. Jessica, I said, leaning forward. I know about the blackmail. Her face went pale. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the emails, the texts, the ones where you threaten him. Don't lie to me, Jess. I've seen them. She froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Finally, she managed. You went through my stuff. You're damn right I did. My voice was cold, sharper than I'd ever heard it before. And you know what else I found? Proof that he's ready to bury you. So don't sit there and play the victim. You're not trapped, Jess. You're just as guilty as he is. For a moment, I thought she might lash out, scream, deny everything. But she didn't. Instead, she just deflated, like all the fight had gone out of her. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she whispered. "I just wanted to protect us, to protect what we built." I laughed, short, bitter, and humorless. "Protect us? Are you kidding me? Jess, you blew up our marriage. You used me. You lied to me. Don't you dare sit there and pretend this was for my sake." She didn't say anything after that, just stared at the table, her hands trembling in her lap. I stood up, grabbing my phone. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "You're going to cut this shit off completely. No more texts, no more emails, no more games. You're going to sit down with a lawyer, and we're going to figure out how to handle this without dragging me down with you. Because if you don't, I'll take everything I have to the police, to your company, to his family. I don't care. Do you understand me?" She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "Scott, please. Do you understand me?" I repeated, my voice like steel. She nodded, defeated. I walked out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My hands were still shaking, but for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But at least now, I had the upper hand. For once, I was in control. The house was quiet after our confrontation. Too quiet. Jessica spent most of her time locked away in the guest room, and I couldn't bear to be around her. Every time I saw her, it felt like a slap in the face. The person I trusted, the person I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with, had turned into someone I didn't even recognize. But the silence didn't last long. A few days later, Jessica's boss decided to make his move. It started with an email. Not to Jessica, not to me, but to the board of her company. He framed himself as the victim, a man seduced and blackmailed by a subordinate. He even attached screenshots of Jessica's emails and texts, carefully edited to paint himself as the innocent party. It was like watching a chess match where I didn't even know the rules. Jessica found out about the email before I did. She came storming into the living room, her face red with panic. "He's trying to ruin me," she shouted, shoving her phone into my face. "He's going to destroy everything." I didn't respond. I just stared at her, wondering how the hell we'd gotten to this point. A part of me wanted to say, "Good, let him." But I couldn't. As much as I hated her for what she'd done, I knew that if he succeeded, it wouldn't just be her life he ruined, it would be mine too. That's when I realized something. I wasn't just a bystander in this mess. I was collateral damage. And if I didn't take control, I'd go down with both of them. I spent the rest of the day digging through every scrap of evidence I had. Texts, emails, the PI's photos. By the time I was done, I had a timeline of their entire sordid affair, complete with receipts. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with it, but it felt good to have something concrete in my hands. Jessica, meanwhile, was spiraling. She spent hours pacing the house, muttering to herself, occasionally stopping to glare at me like this was somehow my fault. At one point, she even accused me of being in cahoots with her boss. "You're working with him, aren't you?" she spat. "You want me to fail?" I didn't even dignify that with a response. She was unraveling, and frankly, I didn't care. She'd made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. But then something unexpected happened. Jessica's boss showed up at our house. It was late, well past midnight, when I heard the knock at the door. At first, I thought it was a neighbor, or maybe the police. But when I opened it, there he was, standing on my porch like he had every right to be there. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and steady. I didn't invite him in. "Get the hell off my property," I snapped. He didn't move. "Scott, I know you're angry. I get it. But you need to understand something. This isn't just about Jessica and me anymore. It's about you, too. I wanted to punch him right then and there, but I forced myself to stay calm. You've got 2 seconds to leave before I call the cops. He smirked, like he knew I wouldn't do it. You think this is just going to go away, he said. You think you can just sit back and watch while she burns? Newsflash, Scott. When she goes down, so do you. Your name's all over this. Bank accounts, shared assets. Hell, your house might as well have a bullseye on it. I slammed the door in his face and locked it. But his words stuck with me. He was right, damn it. I couldn't just wait for this to blow over. I needed to act, and fast. The next day, I called the PI again. I need more, I said. Not just about Jessica, but about him too. The PI didn't ask questions. He just got to work. And me? I started preparing for war. The days that followed were a blur. It felt like I was living in a bad movie. A drama with too many twists and no clear way out. Jessica was unraveling. Her boss was circling like a vulture, and I was stuck in the middle, holding on to whatever scraps of sanity I had left. The PI came through for me, though. Turns out Jessica's boss had skeletons in his closet, too. Big ones. Tax evasion, questionable expenses, even a quiet payout to another employee a few years back. It wasn't just juicy gossip, it was leverage. And in this game, leverage was the only thing that mattered. I didn't tell Jessica what I'd found. Frankly, I didn't trust her not to use it in some reckless, self-serving way. Instead, I decided to confront her boss directly. Not at our house, not at his office, but in a neutral public place where he couldn't pull any tricks. We met at a coffee shop downtown. He was cocky, like he thought he'd already won. "Scott," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I'm surprised you wanted to talk. I figured you'd just sit this one out." I didn't rise to the bait. Instead, I slid a folder across the table. "I know what you've been up to." He frowned, flipping through the papers inside. His face paled as he read. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice tight. "Doesn't matter," I said. "What matters is what happens next." He stared at me, his bravado cracking. "Are you threatening me?" "No," I said, leaning forward. "Giving you an out. You drop this, all of it. The emails to the board, the threats to Jessica. You walk away, and I won't take this to the authorities." "And if I don't?" I smiled, though it didn't reach my eyes. "Then your career, your reputation, and probably your marriage go up in flames. Your choice." He sat there for a long time, weighing his options. Finally, he sighed. "Fine," he said, his voice heavy with defeat. "I'll back off." I didn't trust him, not completely, but it was a start. At least now I had some breathing room to figure out what to do about Jessica. When I got home, she was waiting for me. "Where were you?" she demanded, her eyes red from crying. "Taking care of things," I said, brushing past her. "What does that mean?" I turned to face her, my expression hard. "It means I've done more to clean up your mess than you ever have." Her face crumpled, but I didn't feel sorry for her. Not anymore. "Scott, I'm sorry," she whispered. "For everything." "Sorry doesn't cut it, Jess," I said, my voice cold. "You didn't just hurt me. You destroyed everything we built. And for what? A promotion? A bigger paycheck?" She didn't answer, just sank into a chair and buried her face in her hands. I wanted to feel something. Anger, sadness, anything. But all I felt was emptiness. In the weeks that followed, I started untangling myself from her, piece by piece. I opened a separate bank account, moved my important documents out of the house, and started talking to a divorce lawyer. Jessica tried to make amends, but it was too little, too late. The trust was gone, and without it, There was nothing left to salvage. The final straw came when I found out she'd been in contact with her boss again. She swore it wasn't romantic, just damage control, but I didn't care. It was over. The divorce was messy, as I'd expected. But walking away from her, walking away from the life I thought we had, was the hardest thing I'd ever done. In the end, I wasn't just mourning the loss of my marriage. I was mourning the version of myself who believed in her, who believed in us. That man was gone, and I wasn't sure who I was without him. But here's the thing. I'm still standing. A little bruised, a little broken, but still here. And for the first time in a long time, I'm learning how to rebuild not just my life, but myself.